The Orpheus, a 12,000-ton freighter, wasn't supposed to die. It was a beast of welded steel, built to shrug off the worst the Atlantic could throw at it. But the storm that found her 200 nautical miles off the coast was a different kind of monster, a chaotic, screaming vortex that drove a wall of water into her side with the force of a planetary collision. For the crew, it was a sudden, violent end. For Aris Thorne, the ship's chief engineer, it was the beginning of a descent into a unique and terrifying hell. Aris wasn't on deck when the final blow came. He was deep in the ship's belly, fighting a losing battle against a burst seam in the engine room. The last thing he remembered was the sounder groan of metal so profound it felt like the planet itself was breaking apart. The world tilted violently, and a cold, black tsunami rushed in, swallowing machinery, light, and hope. He was thrown, tumbled, and slammed against a steel bulkhead. Then, nothing but cold and silence. When consciousness returned, it was a thief in the night. It brought no light, only a crushing awareness. He was alive, he was trapped, and he was entombed in absolute darkness. The air was thick, warm, and carried the foul cocktail of salt, diesel, and his own rising panic. He was treading water, but his head was in a pocket of air. He had become a tenant in a sinking coffin, his life now measured not in days, but in the cubic feet of stale air trapped with him. The first 24 hours. The geometry of despair. Aris's engineer mind immediately tried to map his prison. With trembling hands, he felt the contours of his world. A slanted ceiling of cold steel, maybe 10 feet across. A single, unforgiving wall. The water, cold enough to leach his body heat, was his floor. He was in a corner of a cargo hold or a sealed compartment, a bubble of atmosphere the sinking Orpheus had snatched from the surface world as a cruel, temporary joke. His watch, miraculously, was still lit. Lassay's morning. He had no morning. He had only an eternal, starless midnight. He began the calculations. The grim arithmetic of survival. X cubic feet of air. Y breaths per minute. CO2 buildup. The numbers were a death sentence. He shut down the engineer. He had to become something else to survive. The second 24 hours. The symphony of the damned time dissolved. His watch became a meaningless counter in a void. The cold was a constant, gnawing presence. But the silence was worse, until he learned to listen. The ship was not silent. It was a symphony of dying sounds. Every few hours, a deep, resonant boom would shudder through the hollow compartment somewhere, finally giving in to the pressure, collapsing in on itself. Each one was a tremor in his chest, a reminder that his fragile pocket was next. He could hear the creaks and moans of the metal, the groans of a leviathan in its death throes. And then there were the smaller, more intimate sounds. The gentle, terrifying lap of the water against the wall, and the occasional, heart-stopping plink of a single drop of water falling from the ceiling into the blackness. Each plink was a clock tick, marking the slow condensation of his very breath back into the sea. Hallucinations began to dance at the edge of his vision, flashes of light that weren't there. The smell of his wife's perfume, the sound of his daughter's laughter, echoing down a steel corridor that existed only in his mind. Ifak Tim clinging to a single, tangible artifact, the locket in his pocket containing a photo of his family. In the pitch black, he would press its cold metal to his lips, the ridges of the photo frame a braille message of love, the only real thing left. The third 24 hours. The bargain. His body was failing. Thirst was a dessert in his throat. Hunger was a dull, forgotten ache. The air was now thick and heavy, each breath a labor. He felt a profound drowsiness, a siren's call to just close his eyes and let the water take him. The CO2 was winning. It was then that Aris Thorne made a final, desperate bargain with the universe. He stopped fighting the hallucinations. Instead, he invited them in. He held full, lucid conversations with his wife, describing the intricate piping systems he had loved. He told his daughter a story about a great metal whale that swam to the bottom of the ocean to find the biggest pearl. He populated his darkness with the ghosts of his life, and they in turn, kept the ghost of him alive. He lost track of how long he had been talking to his daughter when a new sound pierced his manufactured reality. It wasn't a groan or a plink. It was a rhythmic, methodical thump. Thump, thump. It was the sound of a sonar pinger from a search vessel far above. A sound he, as an engineer, recognized. Hope, a sensation more painful than the cold, flared in his chest. The rescue, a violent rebirth. The diver who found him was not a man, but an angel in a pressurized suit, his headlamp a supernova in Aris's world. The beam cut through the black, illuminating the horrifying truth of his prison, the rust, the slime, the terrifyingly small space. Communication was impossible. The diver signaled with sharp, urgent hand movements. A second diver appeared. They had to get a pressurized helmet on him before they could even attempt to bring him up. The process was a violent, claustrophobic struggle in the pitch-black water. As they ascended, the real danger began. Aris's body, saturated with nitrogen from the highly pressurized air pocket, was a potential time bomb. A rapid ascent would see the gas fizz in his bloodstream like a shaken soda, giving him the benza painful and often fatal condition. The divers took him to a decompression chamber, where his body was slowly, carefully weaned off the pressure it had called home for 3 days. When the chamber door finally opened, the first breath of fresh, unpressured air was like fire in his lungs. The light was agony. The faces of the doctors were blurred and shimmering. Aris Thorne had spent 72 hours in a sunken cathedral of steel, a prisoner in an air pocket, a castaway in the most isolated place on Earth. He was rescued not just from the sea, but from the very edge of oblivion. He returned to the world, a living ghost, a man who had held a conversation with death in a language of creaking metal and falling water, and who had, against all laws of nature and probability, simply refused to agree on the terms. The world was too much. The medevac helicopter was not a vehicle, but a cavern of screaming machinery, each thud of the rotor a physical blow against Aris's hypersensitive hearing. The clean, antiseptic air of the hospital was a shocking emptiness after the thick, chemical-laden atmosphere of his prison. He kept expecting to feel the cold kiss of steel against his back, the gentle, menacing lap of water. They called him the Miracle Man. The press camped outside the hospital, their camera flashes like the lightning of the storm that had taken the Orpheus. Doctors marveled at his physical state: severe dehydration, hypothermia, a body starved and battered, but intact. It was a medical marvel that he had not succumbed to the cold or carbon dioxide narcosis. But the real damage was not on the charts. It was in the silence between his words. It was in the way he would startle at the sound of a dripping tap in his hospital room, his heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to escape. It was in his eyes, which had grown accustomed to a darkness so absolute that even the soft glow of a nightlight seemed intrusive. His wife, Elena, held his hand as if he were a ghost that might dissipate. Her touch was both an anchor and a shock. For 3 days, her memory had been a phantom he conversed with to stay sane. Now, her realness, the warmth of her skin, the slight callus on her finger from her gardening, was overwhelming. Their daughter, Lily, was hesitant, peering at him from the doorway. The man in the bed smelled like a hospital, not like her dad. "They said you were in a bubble," Elena whispered, her voice thick with tears she'd long since cried. "An air pocket." Aris nodded, the movement feeling alien. "A pocket," he echoed, his voice a dry rasp. It was a very loud silence. How could he explain the symphony of destruction? The groans of dying steel were etched into his bones. He could still feel them, a low-frequency vibration in his soul. The psychologists came and went, talking about PTSD, about survivor's guilt. They used words like trauma and reintegration. Aris listened politely. They understood the science of the mind, but they did not understand the geometry of his despair. They hadn't felt the precise, terrifying plink of a single water drop marking the passage of a lifetime. Back home, in the comforting familiarity of his suburban house, the nightmares began. Not of drowning, but of expansion. He would dream of the air pocket suddenly growing, the walls receding until he was a tiny, insignificant speck in a vast, dark ocean hall. He would wake up gasping, not from lack of air, but from the terror of infinite space. After being confined, he found himself drawn to small, enclosed spaces. The walk-in pantry, the space under the stairs. He would sit there in the dark, not out of fear, but out of a perverse sense of comfort. It was in these moments that he felt closest to understanding what had happened to him. He had been forged in pressure and darkness, and a part of him had adapted, had become a creature of that environment. One afternoon, A found Lily's toy magnet in her room, a simple horseshoe magnet with a few colored plastic discs. He held it in his hand, feeling its pull, and was instantly transported back to the engine room of the Orpheus, to the giant electromagnets used for lifting heavy equipment. The memory wasn't terrifying. It was specific, technical. It was the first memory from the ship that hadn't been coated in fear. This was the key. He began to write, not a memoir for the public, but a technical manual of his own survival. He started with what he knew. The ship. He drew schematics of the Orpheus from memory, tracing the likely path of the flooding. He calculated the volume of his air pocket based on the duration of his survival and his estimated respiratory rate. He theorized about the chemical composition of the air in his final hours. He was deconstructing his nightmare with the tools of an engineer. The phantom booms became data points on a pressure graph. The creeping cold became a heat-loss calculation. By turning his trauma into a series of problems to be solved, he was slowly reclaiming it. He was no longer just a victim of the sea. He was the chief engineer of his own survival, even in retrospect. Months later, on a bright, sunny day that felt entirely wrong for the occasion, he visited the Maritime Inquiry. He was asked to testify about the Orpheus's final moments. The room was sterile, filled with officials and lawyers. When it was his turn, he didn't speak of the terror or the hallucinations. He spoke of the burst seam in the engine room. He described the specific grade of steel used in the hull and its sheer strength. He talked about the sequence of the alarms he heard before the lights went out. But then he paused. He looked at the expectant faces in the room. People who wanted a simple story of a shipwreck. "They tell me I survived in an air pocket," he said, his voice steady now, stronger. "But that's not quite right. An air pocket is a passive thing, an accident of physics. I survived inside something else. I survived inside a memory. I survived inside the love for my family, which became a tangible thing I could hold on to in the dark. I survived inside the logic of my own training, which gave my mind a fortress to hide in when my body was failing." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had felt the walls of his tomb. "The sea took the Orpheus, but it couldn't take me, because I wasn't just in a pocket of air. I was in a pocket of me." The room was silent. He had given them the facts, the data they needed. But in that moment, he had given himself the truth he needed. Aris Thorne walked out of the inquiry and into the overwhelming brightness of the day. He didn't flinch. The world was still too much, too loud, too bright. But now, he carried a little of his darkness within him, not as a prisoner, but as a source of strength. A deep, quiet well of resilience from the bottom of the sea. A reminder that even in the most absolute darkness, a single, stubborn breath is a universe of hope.